Ever wondered what medieval people wore and why they couldn't stop scratching? From flea-filled furs to fungus-infested tunics fashioned in the Middle Ages wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a health hazard. Let's unravel the itchiest century in history. Think your clothes are annoying? Try living in the Middle Ages where your entire wardrobe was designed to trap heat, trap moisture and trap parasites, sometimes all three at once. That hoodie you're wearing. It has pockets. You can stash snacks tissues, maybe a sense of self-worth. Medieval peasants had tunics, no pockets, no zippers, no hope. Just a big, itchy rectangle of wool that soaked up sweat and shame in equal measure. Wool was everywhere. Not the soft merino kind you cuddle up with in winter. This was medieval wool, thick and scratchy like someone knitted a sweater out of aggressive moss. It was coarse enough to exfoliate your skin just by existing. People wore it directly over their bodies, and since undergarments were optional or non-existent, wool became the medieval loofah. Except it didn't clean. It chafed. It itched. And it made everyone smell like damp livestock left in a sauna. But wait, there's more. You know that satisfying feeling when you wash your clothes and they come out smelling like lavender fields? Yeah, forget that. Medieval people rarely if ever washed their outer garments. Why? Because soaking wool in water without modern soap just makes it shrink, stink and start its own fungus colony. Laundry wasn't a weekly chore. It was a last resort when the stench threatened to summon demons. So what happened when these clothes got dirty? They just stayed that way. Dirt built up like geological layers. Sweat, mud, blood, a little wine, a lot of questionable stains. Each added a new chapter to the tragic saga of one's tunic. And since personal hygiene was also considered a luxury or a sin depending on the decade, these clothes weren't just filthy. They were ecosystems. Entire civilizations of fleas, lice and mites thrived in every seam. Lice were the real winners of medieval fashion. These little guys had season passes to every scalp, armpit and crotch in Europe. And guess what? People didn't see them as a major problem. They were more like permanent roommates you occasionally crushed during prayer. Combing them out was a communal bonding activity often done during mealtime. Picture it mums picking nits from your hair while passing the mutton. Bon appetit. And don't get too smug, nobles. You think being rich spared you? Nope. If anything, your fancy embroidered cloak was a 5-star resort for pests. All those layers and hidden folds liced Disneyland. Plus fur trims meant more body heat, which meant more sweat, which meant more bugs. Even the king wasn't safe. Royal robes were often lined with squirrel pelts, which were adorable until they started moving on their own. Now here's the kicker. Most medieval folks genuinely thought they were doing okay. I only have 7 fleas today. God is good, it was all relative. Smell was just part of the social wallpaper. If everyone around you reeks like goat cheese left in a cathedral, you stop noticing. Until someone from another village shows up wearing slightly less putrid clothes and suddenly you're the stinky one. Fashion War's 13th century edition. So yes, your hoodie is made of soft cotton. It's washable. It doesn't come with a free infestation. It probably even matches your jeans. You might not appreciate it now, but compared to a medieval peasant's outfit, your hoodie is a luxury spaceship of comfort and personal dignity. And it has pockets. Pockets. A medieval peasant would have killed for those. Meanwhile, they were tying pouches to belts or stuffing things into their socks. Imagine living in a world so backward that every time you needed a coin, you had to lift your tunic, untie a leather satchel, and pray a rat hadn't nested in it. So next time you casually toss your sweatshirt in the laundry, take a moment to honour the unwashed heroes of the past. They walked so you could dry clean. Let's start with the cold, itchy truth for most people in the Middle Ages. Underwear was a myth like unicorns or bathing more than once a season. There was no elastic waistband, no breathable cotton, no morning routine involving a drawer full of neatly folded boxer briefs. Instead, you had two options: go commando under your wool tunic and hope for the best, or tie a strip of linen between your legs and pray it didn't ride up mid-harvest. The medieval crotch situation was not, shall we say, well managed. For men, the so-called brays were as close to underwear as it got. Imagine a loose pair of knee-length shorts made out of scratchy linen or hemp tied at the waist with a drawstring. They were designed less for comfort and more for containment. They sagged, bunched, and absorbed sweat like a medieval sham wow. If you were a knight or noble, you might have a slightly nicer pair, maybe even a belt to hold them up. But if you were a peasant, your brays probably doubled as your only nightwear, swimwear, and spiritual test. Now women had it worse. Much worse. Most medieval women didn't wear anything under their dresses at all, not because it was freeing, but because it was expected. No panties, no undergarments to prevent chafing. Just their skin, a thick wool dress, and the unforgiving friction of daily labour. Between sweating in the field, sitting on hard benches, and walking miles on uneven roads, their thighs became the battlegrounds of history, rubbed raw by fabric work and shame. There's this absurd modern fantasy that medieval ladies were somehow dainty, laced in romantic garments and flowing lace. Reality check: a noblewoman might have a linen chemise, but even that got washed so rarely it could stand up on its own. Most peasant women wore a single shift under their dress if they were lucky, and it did nothing to protect from the icy wind or invasive wildlife crawling up their skirts. Imagine squatting in a field and getting an unexpected tick bite where the sun doesn't shine. That's not medieval romance, that's just Tuesday. And speaking of hygiene, let's talk about that time of the month, shall we? Menstrual care in the Middle Ages was a tragic combination of wishful thinking and fabric scraps. No tampons, no pads, no dignity. Women would stuff rags between their legs, which often weren't held by anything, because remember, no underwear. Sometimes they just stayed home sitting on straw, sometimes they didn't. Either way, leaks were common and stains were expected. It wasn't shameful because it was hidden. It was shameful because it wasn't. The church, of course, had an opinion about all this. Surprise, it was horrible. Menstruating women were considered unclean, and some were barred from entering holy places. Because nothing screams divine love like turning natural biology into a social exile. Meanwhile, the men deciding these rules were wandering around in parasite-infested robes, with zero knowledge of what a uterus even was. But hey, at least they had theology on their side, right? And it wasn't just women who suffered from the lack of decent undergarments. Men dealt with a whole other set of problems, starting with what happened when they needed to pee. Brays had to be untied and lowered, which was great if you had a solid 10 minutes in privacy. But if you were in the middle of a battlefield or a plague-ridden street, your options were limited. Hence why many just hiked their tunic and let it fly. Dignity died so that convenience could live. The result, a society where people were constantly scratching, adjusting, and airing out their nether regions. Lice, fleas, and mysterious rashes were part of daily life. Why does my skin burn was less a medical concern and more a philosophical question. Doctors might suggest leeches. Priests might suggest confession. No one suggested underwear because it simply wasn't a priority like brushing your teeth or not dying at 30. Even among the elite, underwear was more about performance than comfort. Courtiers wore tight-fitting hose that were often sewn directly to their doublets, meaning that if you needed to go, you had to unbutton half your outfit like you were defusing a bomb. Imagine being at a royal feast 10 goblets of wine deep and realising you have to unravel your entire outfit just to pee behind a tapestry. That's not elegance. That's a wardrobe malfunction waiting to become a scandal. But here's where it gets truly weird. Despite all the suffering, many medieval people saw clothing discomfort as a virtue. Wearing rough cloth was considered pious. Suffering through heat, cold, and chafing, a way to get closer to God. There are actual records of saints refusing clean clothes because they wanted to mortify the flesh. Translation: they wanted their groin rash to be holy, martyrdom but make it itchy. Let's not forget children in this nightmare scenario. Babies didn't get diapers. They got swaddled, tightly wrapped in cloth so they couldn't move. Sounds cozy until you realise they just peed and pooped in those wraps which were rarely changed. Toddler underpants. Please. Most kids went naked from the waist down until they were old enough to work. Childhood was just a countdown to when you could finally earn the privilege of uncomfortable pants. And yet somehow humanity survived. Generation after generation endured the burns bites and butt-cheek abrasions of underwear-free living. Not because they were strong, not because they were noble, but because they had no other choice. You couldn't walk into a medieval Walmart and pick up a six-pack of Hanes. You worked with what you had, and what you had was cloth rope and pain. So the next time you slip on your favourite pair of stretchy, breathable, non-lethal underwear, take a moment to appreciate the miracles of elastic and fabric engineering. You're not just putting on a pair of briefs, you're participating in centuries of hard-won progress. Your waistband is a symbol of victory. Your comfort is the revenge of the rash-covered peasants who walked so your thighs could glide. And if you're ever tempted to complain that your underwear has a loose thread or doesn't fit quite right, just remember once upon a time someone squatted in a field with nothing but burlap between them and the elements. No gusset, no dignity, just a prayer and a whole lot of itching. Let's talk about linen, the miracle fabric of the Middle Ages. Not because it actually worked miracles, but because people desperately hoped it would. Linen was light, breathable and white, which meant it could be bleached in the sun and gave off the illusion of cleanliness. It was essentially the Middle Ages version of deodorant, not because it stopped odour, but because it made you feel like you were trying. A linen shirt didn't keep you fresh. It just delayed your descent into full-blown human swamp. Here's how it worked. The linen shirt, or chemise, was the first layer against the skin. It was supposed to absorb the sweat like a medieval sponge. You wore it under everything: tunics, dresses, armour, shame. The logic was this: since the linen touched your body and the wool or silk, didn't you only had to wash the linen? Problem: they barely washed that either. At best, it got aired out on a windowsill. At worst, it became a biohazard. There were monks who literally slept in the same linen shirt for decades. Their corpses were probably less smelly. Now, in theory, linen was the great equalizer. Nobles wore it, peasants wore it. But like everything else in the Middle Ages, quality varied. Rich people had fine, soft linen that draped like a dream. Poor folks had something closer to a cheese grater. Rough, scratchy, stiff, like sleeping in a sack of dried celery. And since most linen was undyed, it didn't hide sweat stains. Every stain became a badge of honour, or dishonour, or mildew. And sweat. Oh, there was so much sweat. Medieval Europe didn't have central air or breathable office spaces. They had layers on layers. People worked in the fields, sat in crowded halls, fought in armour and climbed stairs in castles with no ventilation. Even on a good day, your linen shirt was soaked through by noon. On a bad day, it was basically soup. There's a reason nobody hugged each other back then. It wasn't manners. It was self-preservation. Linen also had the unfortunate habit of holding on to smells. You'd think a shirt made from flax would air out easily. Nope. Once it got wet, and it always got wet, it turned into a microbial sauna. Combined with a medieval diet of onions, garlic and bad beer, the result was a scent profile best described as feral barn animal meets compost pile. Perfume wasn't just for decoration, it was for survival. People doused themselves in rosewater, lavender oil, or in extreme cases vinegar. Because if the stench didn't kill you, the lice surely would. And speaking of lice, they loved linen. They thrived in it, nested in it, partied in it like it was spring break for parasites. Linen shirts became breeding grounds for every tiny creature that didn't pay rent. People were constantly scratching. You'd be praying in church and see someone casually reach into their collar for a quick itch-scratch combo. That's not a sign of spiritual fervour. That's a louse getting too comfortable. Now here's where it gets ironic. Linen was technically washable. It could be boiled, scrubbed, dried. But washing linen took time, water, and effort, 3 things peasants never had and nobles never used. Laundry day was more like laundry month, and even then it involved dragging your shirt to the nearest stream, scrubbing it with lye or ashes, then slapping it against rocks like it owed you money. That shirt may have survived the wash, but your soul probably didn't. But wait, what about drying? Well, if the sun was out, great. If not, you hung your shirt indoors next to the open hearth, where it soaked up the delightful aroma of wet dog soot and stale meat. Once clean, it went right back onto your unwashed body, ready to begin the cycle of absorption again. Think of it as a medieval sponge, if the sponge were alive, weeping and questioning its purpose in the universe. We can't forget the tailoring aspect either. Linen shirts weren't always well made. For the poor, they were shapeless rectangles with holes for arms and heads. No darts, no fit, no flattery. You could be the most sculpted farmhand in the county and still look like a laundry sack stuffed with potatoes. The rich got better cuts, pleats, lace, maybe even embroidery. But they still had to contend with the sweat and stench. Even gold thread smells bad after a week in the armpit jungle. The thing is, everyone believed in linen. They thought it was clean, noble and protective. Doctors even recommended it. Wear linen next to the skin to absorb the harmful humours, they said, as if sweat was some kind of demonic essence that could be defeated by flax fibres. Of course, these same doctors also prescribed leeches, so maybe don't take their fashion advice too seriously. The real tragedy, linen shirts were sometimes passed down. Yes, hand-me-down underwear. Your brother's shirt became your shirt. Your father's sweat became your sweat. Generational trauma, but make it literal. Some families had one good shirt and rotated it for weddings, funerals, and public floggings. Imagine sharing your only decent piece of clothing for both court appearances and cousin marriages. That's not family. That's fabric-based codependency. And don't even get us started on how linen was stored. In chests, in damp cellars, sometimes folded under heavy stones to flatten it out. All it did was attract moths, mould, and despair. People didn't own closets. They owned a pile of crumpled, mildewed cloth that might pass as a shirt if you squinted in a dark church during Lent. Even the church got involved. Monks wore linen under their habits, believing it protected them from temptation. Spoiler, it didn't. All it did was give them heat rash and a divine excuse to complain. Saints were canonized despite their stench, not because they rose above it. There's no record of anyone being declared holy for smelling decent. If there were, we'd have far fewer martyrs and a lot more soap. So next time you put on a crisp, clean t-shirt and complain that it's too tight or slightly itchy, remember the millions who came before you soaked, steaming and scratching under linen armour. They didn't know comfort. They knew survival. Their shirts didn't just absorb sweat. They absorbed sin, sorrow, and several species of insect. They wore them with pride, and possibly ringworm. And when you do laundry, when you drop your shirt into a magic spinning box and pull it out smelling like citrus fields and hope take a moment, whisper a quiet thank you to your ancestors. Then hug your dryer, because linen may have been the medieval deodorant, but modern hygiene, that's the miracle. If you've ever done the sniff test on a t-shirt before a Zoom call, congratulations, you're halfway to medieval fashion. Because in the Middle Ages, people didn't wear the same outfit 2 days in a row. They wore it for 2 decades. Laundry wasn't a chore, it was a fantasy. Clothes were expensive, rare, and treated more like precious relics than daily necessities. If you owned 3 full outfits, you were either royalty or hallucinating. Let's be clear, most peasants had 1 set of clothes. 1. Maybe 2 if they'd recently robbed a corpse. You woke up, you put on your tunic, and you prayed it hadn't frozen overnight. That same tunic went with you to the field, the market church, weddings, funerals, and your eventual burial. It was a lifelong companion, your armour, your curse. And yes, it smelled like every mistake you'd ever made. And the smells. Ooh, the smells. Wearing wool every day without washing it created a perfume of its own sweat, manure, mould, and whatever you'd stepped in that morning. Soap was expensive, time was scarcer, and even when people did try to clean their clothes, It often meant beating them with sticks next to a river, while whispering regrets into the breeze. The water was cold, the soap was lye, your shirt came back stiffer than your social skills. But it wasn't just peasants. Nobles wore the same clothes over and over too, just with more lace and better denial. Royalty had multiple garments, yes, but changing often was still rare, because dressing required assistance. A simple outfit could take an hour, 2 servants, and a minor spiritual crisis. And once you were laced into that silk monstrosity, you stayed there. All day. Through meals, prayers, and potentially vomiting. That's why medieval portraits always look stiff. It's not just artistic style, it's because the people inside those clothes literally couldn't move. A lady in full court dress had roughly the mobility of a scarecrow in a windstorm. Layers of linen, wool, velvet, fur, all stacked like a pastry of suffering. God help you if you dropped something. Bending down wasn't worth it. That apple could rot. Dignity first. Children weren't spared from the fabric prison. Medieval kids didn't wear playful outfits or colourful cotton. They wore mini versions of adult clothes, tunics, belts, tiny hose. No elastic, no fun, and they were expected to keep them clean somehow while rolling in mud and chasing goats. If you soiled your only tunic, you just had to keep wearing it until the stain became part of your personality. Now picture winter. You're wearing the same damp wool you wore in spring, only now it's frozen solid. There's no insulation, no dry change of clothes. You sleep in your outfit, sweat in it, cry in it. And when it finally thaws in March, it brings with it the gentle aroma of 6 months of trapped despair. At that point, it's not just clothing, it's a second skin one that wants you dead. Summer wasn't better. Heat made wool unbearable and linen soaked through in minutes. But stripping down wasn't an option. Modesty laws and biting insects made sure of that. So you cooked in your clothes. Literally. People fainted in church from heat stroke. Fainting was considered fashionable, especially among women, but really it was the body saying, I give up. Please release me from this medieval sauna. Even religious figures weren't spared. Monks wore the same robes every day, often without undergarments. Their cloisters smelled like heaven, only if your idea of heaven includes mildew incense and spiritual BO. Some monasteries actually had rules against bathing too often. Cleanliness was vanity, suffering was holy, and skin infections were apparently part of God's mysterious plan. To make matters worse, people didn't even own closets. Clothes were stored in wooden chests often shared among family members. Mould, definitely. Mice, of course. Imagine digging through a box of fabric that hasn't been aired out since the last plague and finding your Sunday best next to a dead beetle. It's like thrifting but with tetanus. And then came the repairs. Clothes were too valuable to replace, so they were patched, restitched and held together with hopes and hair. You could spot a peasant by the number of patches on their elbows. Each one was a visible reminder that fashion in the Middle Ages was less about style and more about survival. The more colourful your tunic, the more suspiciously people stared. Because where the hell did you get red dye, Jeff? Speaking of dye, most people wore brown grey or off-white. Not because they liked it, but because those were the colours that came from rubbing mud on sheep. Bright colours were reserved for the rich, or for people who didn't mind breaking sumptuary laws and risking jail time for that sweet, sweet violet tunic. Seriously, you could be fined for looking too fabulous. And yet, despite the filth, the rot and the relentless smell of human soup, there was pride in clothing. People passed down their garments to children. Wives made shirts for husbands before battle. A well-mended cloak could mean the difference between freezing and functioning. Clothes were stitched with love grief and sometimes literal blood. They were heavy physically, emotionally, spiritually. So the next time you complain that your shirt doesn't spark joy, imagine living in a world where you only owned one and it smelled like wet fireplace. Imagine wearing it while harvesting turnips, then attending a wedding, then fighting a guy over land rights. And then imagine sleeping in it, farting in it, and waking up to do it all again. Every single day. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't about expression. It was about endurance. You didn't wear what you liked, you wore what didn't disintegrate. And if it made you ache or smell like sin, well, that just meant it was working. Because comfort was for the next life. This one was meant to be survived in wool. Wool was the Swiss Army knife of medieval fabric, except if every tool on the knife gave you a rash. It was warm, yes, durable technically, but it also turned every medieval body into a steamy, damp petri dish. Forget about breathable cotton or moisture-wicking synthetics. Wool didn't wick, it clung, like guilt, or a damp relative who won't leave your house. You didn't wear wool so much as you surrendered to it. Peasants lived in wool, slept in wool, were baptized, married, and buried in wool. It was the default setting of existence, scratchy, itchy, and thick enough to make you feel like you were wrapped in a wet dog. The raw stuff came straight off the sheep, barely cleaned, spun by hand and woven into garments that could stop a blade but not a smell. You want armour? Try surviving August in a full wool tunic without passing out or murdering someone. Wool absorbed moisture like it had abandonment issues. Sweat rain tears, it drank it all and then refused to let go. If you got wet, you stayed wet. For hours, maybe days, and the smell, imagine compost. Now heat it. Now press that to your skin for 16 hours while you shovel manure. That was the medieval fragrance industry in one outfit odor-rotting shepherd. And don't let the term washed wool fool you. Washing was rare and risky. Wool shrinks if you so much as look at it wrong in hot water, so people avoided cleaning it. Instead, they brushed off dirt with sticks or hung garments near fires, in the hopes that smoke counted as purification. It didn't. It just added another layer of scent, smoke-marinated body funk with notes of despair. Then there was the texture. Modern wool can be soft, luxurious even. Not so in medieval Europe. This was rough staple wool, scratchier than regret and twice as clingy. It irritated your skin so badly that people believed the itching was part of God's divine plan. Want to show piety? Put on your coarse wool robe and itch your way into heaven. Bonus points if you bled. Now imagine layering it. Most peasants didn't own coats or cloaks. They layered tunics. A rough wool tunic over a rougher wool shirt. Add in some sweat rain and whatever fungus was growing in the seams, and congratulations, you are now a fully mobile biohazard. And let's not forget fleas. Fleas loved wool. It was warm, cosy, and right next to the skin buffet. You weren't just a human. You were a food court with legs. Speaking of pests, wool was an open invitation to every crawling thing that liked warmth and darkness. Mites nested in sleeves, lice bred in collars, and bedbugs. They didn't wait for the bed. They hung out in your cloak like it was medieval Airbnb. Every time you put your clothes on, you entered a new relationship with parasites, and breaking up was impossible without fire. But wool wasn't just for peasants. The rich wore it too, just dyed and lined and 50 times heavier. Nobles flaunted their status with coloured wool cloaks, lined with fur-embroidered tunics and headwear so elaborate it required scaffolding. But underneath the fashion, same wool, same stench, just wrapped in velvet lies. A rich man's armpit still smelled like cooked cabbage and regret. And colour didn't make it cleaner. In fact, dyeing wool involved boiling it in vats of plant matter, urine and metal salts. Yes, urine. Human pee. They used it to set the dye. So that gorgeous green robe that was brought to you by peasant pea iron powder and several dead beetles. The vibrant colours cost more, but they didn't hide the scent. If anything, they enhanced it like seasoning on a very old, very damp steak. Also, wet wool breeds bacteria like it's running a startup. Trapped moisture plus body heat equals fungal paradise. People got skin infections, boils and rashes from just existing inside their own clothes. You know how sometimes you get a heat rash from bad gym clothes? Imagine that, but it's your only outfit and you live in it 24/7. Medieval self-care was more like medieval self-sabotage. But wait, you say, wasn't wool necessary for winter? Sure, if you didn't mind freezing in style. Wet wool doesn't insulate. Once it soaked through, it became a personal freezer. People died of hypothermia while wearing warm wool cloaks. You'd think they'd at least use waterproof layers. They didn't. The closest thing to waterproofing was rubbing the fabric in animal fat and praying. Prayers didn't dry wet armpits. You know how people today freak out about a scratchy label on the back of their shirt? Try wearing an entire garment made of scratchy labels, and not just for an hour, for life. Wool wasn't just uncomfortable, it was psychological warfare. It taught people endurance and low standards, and why everyone looked vaguely furious in medieval art. Even sleep wasn't an escape. People didn't change into pyjamas, they just collapsed in their clothes, sometimes on straw, sometimes on lice-infested mattresses. Their wool tunics doubled as blankets, which meant the sweat you'd been storing all day now became your midnight perfume. Sweet dreams. And let's not pretend they didn't know it was gross. There are medieval texts complaining about wool's smell, its itchiness, and the fact that it made people look like sad sacks of cabbage. But what choice did they have? Cotton was expensive and rare in Europe. Silk was reserved for the church and people committing fashion sins in God's name, so it was wool, or nothing. And nothing was cold illegal and probably got you excommunicated. So yes, wool kept you alive. But at what cost? You may have survived the frost, but you paid with your skin your dignity and any hope of a fresh scent. Wool wasn't just a fabric. It was a punishment you wore. A moist, fungal, insect-filled reminder that medieval life was not about comfort. It was about enduring the itch until the plague took you first. So next time you complain that your sweater is a little warm or your coat is too heavy, remember this. At least it isn't fermenting against your body like medieval wool. At least it doesn't smell like damp barnyard stew. At least you can take it off, wash it, or set it on fire. The Middle Ages couldn't. If you think money buys comfort, the Middle Ages would like to have a very smelly word with you. Being rich in medieval Europe didn't mean you smelled better. It just meant your stink came wrapped in gold thread. Wealth bought you layers fabric and embroidery, sure. But those layers were heavy, the fabrics were sweat traps, and the embroidery was soaked in dye made of crushed bugs and human pee. In short, the richer you were, the harder it was for your skin to breathe or escape. Take silk, for instance. The most prized fabric in medieval noble closets. Imported from the East at astronomical prices, silk was soft, shiny, and entirely unsuited for the European climate or medieval plumbing standards. It didn't absorb moisture, it held it, trapped it. Silk clung to sweaty noble flesh like an elegant prison. Every step in those castle halls left a whisper of damp nobility in its wake. You looked beautiful. You felt like a hot towel someone left in a cellar. And velvet was the look how rich I am fabric of the day. It was thick, luxurious, and about as breathable as a coffin. Worn during court appearances, feasts, and public floggings. Because nobles loved to show off anywhere, velvet made everyone look like they were ready for a royal portrait and smell like they'd been fermenting in a meat locker. If you wore velvet in summer, you were either showing off or trying to speedrun heatstroke. Fur was the status symbol of the truly elite. Lining your robes with ermine or sable was the medieval equivalent of putting gold rims on your horse. Fur looked regal warm and gave off the vibe of, I don't farm and I don't need to move my own limbs. But fur also retained heat and fleas and sweat and lice. So while the nobility walked around draped in dead animals, those animals were still biting back, sometimes from the grave. Let's talk about shoes. Fancy medieval shoes were long, pointy, and absolutely useless. Nobles wore leather slippers with toes so extended they needed to be tied to the knees. Why fashion? Status. Complete disregard for anatomy. Walking in them was a nightmare. Running, impossible. Escaping an angry mob, not a chance. If your castle was burning, your only hope was to shuffle stylishly toward the exit and pray the flames respected your drip. But nothing screamed rich and ridiculous like the layers. Layers upon layers. A noblewoman might wear a linen chemise and underdress, a kirtle, a surcoat, a belt, jewellery, a veil and a crown all at once. Each layer added warmth weight and exactly zero ventilation. Getting dressed took hours. Getting undressed required assistance prayer, and often a team of women with strong fingers and low expectations. Once you were dressed, you stayed that way, and you sweated through every layer with grace, or at least attempted to. And while these garments looked stunning in portraits, let's be honest, those portraits didn't capture the smell. The court might shimmer with gold thread and brocade, but underneath was a miasma of unwashed bodies, fermented perfume and garments lined with regret. Washing elaborate clothing was out of the question. Cleaning it meant risking the dyes, shrinking the silk, or, heaven forbid, unpicking the embroidery. So nobles didn't clean. They powdered, they perfumed, they denied. And perfume wasn't the delicate mist we know today. It was warfare. Rosewater civet, which came from a cat's butt, yes, and musk from deer testicles were applied liberally. The goal wasn't to smell good, it was to overwhelm the bad. If you entered a room and everyone's eyes watered, you knew you'd succeeded. Courtship by sinus assault. Of course, all this luxury had consequences. Skin diseases ran rampant. Rashes, boils, fungal infections, especially in places polite society didn't mention. Silk and fur don't play well with human sweat. When you trap moisture against the skin and keep it there for weeks, your body rebels. Blisters formed, sores oozed, and if you complained, people told you it was the devil testing your vanity. No spa days, just penance and pus. Noblemen weren't spared either. Their doublets were stiff-tailored tight and stuffed with padding. They couldn't bend. They couldn't breathe. They could barely sit. But damn did they look imposing, until they fainted at dinner from lack of oxygen, or until a tailor had to cut them out of their outfit like medieval paramedics performing a fashion exorcism. The truly rich had servants whose entire job was to manage the clothes. Dressers, laundresses, people who maintained fur. Imagine being so wealthy that someone else had to air out your armpit fabric. That was considered glamorous. Meanwhile, the servants doing the airing often got sick from the exposure. A noblewoman's laundry room was just a plague ward with extra lace. Then came the jewellery. Not delicate, tasteful jewellery, but massive, gaudy hunks of metal that said "I own land" and zero neck muscles. Rings on every finger, chains that could anchor ships, belts encrusted with gemstones. The more you wore, the more important you looked, and the more back pain you had by 40. Chiropractors weren't a thing. Neither was moderation. Even worse, rich clothing made you a target. Robbers loved velvet. Bandits dreamed of brocade. Being well-dressed meant flashing your wealth like a walking treasure chest. There are actual records of nobles being murdered just for their cloaks. Imagine dying for a jacket that makes you smell like roasted goat. And then we have hats. Giant, towering, absurd hats. Some were so wide they couldn't fit through doorways. Others so tall they rivaled chimney stacks. Feathers, jewels, embroidery, everything screamed excess. The bigger the hat, the more empty your bank account. Or your soul. Possibly both. And the real kicker, hats trapped heat. Your head became a portable sauna. Hair was rarely washed, so the sweat just lingered. Hair itself became a breeding ground. Noblewomen often oiled their hair with animal fat and braided it tightly under veils. The result, greasy, crusty hair that acted like flypaper for dirt bugs and gossip. Hairpins were necessary not for style, but for holding down what was essentially a medieval oil slick. And since head coverings were mandatory in many courts, your scalp slowly baked beneath silk and wool like a forgotten loaf of sourdough. So yes, the rich looked good on the surface, but underneath the lace, the velvet, and the embroidered gilt, they were just as itchy, sweaty, and infected as everyone else, just with more jewels. Their clothes didn't breathe. Their skin didn't breathe. Sometimes they stopped breathing altogether, collapsing under the weight of their own fashion. Next time you complain about dry cleaning bills or a scratchy tag on your shirt, remember this medieval nobility suffered for style. They itched, they stank, they risked death by corset heatstroke, by fur, and social humiliation by sweat stains. Their closets were filled with luxury and several health hazards, so be grateful for your cotton t-shirt and your boring breathable jeans, because once upon a time being fashionable meant looking divine while rotting from the inside out. Nothing says luxury quite like wearing dead animals. In the Middle Ages, fur wasn't just a fabric, it was a status symbol, a power statement, and unintentionally a walking zoo. The richer you were, the more furs you wore. Squirrel, ermine, fox, rabbit, even cat, yes, cat. If it had soft fur and bad luck, someone would skin it and stitch it into a duke's collar. The end result: nobility strutted through castle halls looking like taxidermy collections and scratching like they had secrets. Let's begin with ermine. It was the white fur of royalty seen on ceremonial robes and smug portraits. But here's the fun part: ermine turned white only in winter. So to make an ermine robe, you had to trap, kill and skin dozens, sometimes hundreds of them at the exact right time of year. This meant high cost, low ethics, and an infestation risk that would make your skin beg for divine intervention. If one of those furs had fleas, they all had fleas. Congratulations, you just paid a fortune to wear a plague delivery system. But it wasn't just the fur's origins that were cursed. It was what happened after. Fur was rarely cleaned properly. Medieval furriers might beat the pelts, shake them or air them out, maybe even sprinkle herbs. But full-on washing. Not unless you wanted the skins to stiffen like cardboard and smell like wet crypt. So those luscious fur linings stayed full of sweat skin flakes, and every bug smart enough to hide in a seam. Essentially, nobles wore coats made of luxury mould. Fox and rabbit fur were more common, especially for the lower nobility trying to look fancy without selling their manor. These furs didn't carry the royal aura, but they did carry parasites. Rabbit fur in particular was notorious for shedding. By the end of a feast, the host's velvet doublet would look like he hugged a shedding dog during a grease fire. Fox fur had the added bonus of smelling strongly, especially when damp. And in medieval castles, everything was always damp. Let's not ignore the construction of these robes. They weren't just lined with fur, they were stuffed with it, edged with it, and sometimes entirely made of it. Think of it as medieval insulation. If you wrapped yourself in enough layers of dead animal, you could survive a drafty stone keep in January. But warmth came with a price. You also became a walking oven. Sweat poured down your back while fleas danced a conga line in your armpits. And once the robe was on, taking it off without assistance or fainting was a miracle. And then came summer. Did rich people stop wearing fur in summer? Of course not. That would make sense. Instead, they paraded through gardens and banquets with fur-trimmed sleeves sweltering in their own wealth, pretending not to hallucinate from heat stroke. Nobles would literally bake in their own status symbols, turning their clothing into portable sweat lodges. Also, a baron could look more important than a knight with only fox cuffs. Of course, furs weren't just for show, they were also for judgment. The richer the fur, the more attention it drew. The church, never one to miss a chance to guilt trip, often condemned fur as vanity. Some bishops even banned clergy from wearing it, calling it the devil's cloak, which was rich considering many high-ranking clergymen were wrapped in enough sable to smother a horse. But hey, hypocrisy was just another layer in the wardrobe. Servants hated fur coats. Why? Because they were the ones who had to maintain them. Brushing out fleas, hanging the garments over smoke fires to purify them, and pretending not to gag at the sour smell of festering armpits. Imagine waking up, and your job is to deflea a marquis's inner thigh lining before breakfast. And if you failed, your noble boss might accuse you of sabotage or theft. Yes, servants were sometimes searched because nobles thought they were stealing tufts of fur. Imagine stealing one greasy squirrel cuff for personal use. What a treat. The irony. All that fur and nobles still caught colds, fevers and the plague. Wrapping yourself in 30 pounds of infected fluff didn't prevent illness, it invited it. Fleas carried more than just discomfort, they carried disease. Bubonic typhus, whatever was trendy that season. There's something almost poetic about a noble dying from a rat flea that hitched a ride in his 100-florin robe. Fashion meet karma. Let's not forget headwear. Fur-lined hats were all the rage, particularly among men who wanted to show off their masculinity by sweating profusely in front of their enemies. These hats trapped heat and lice equally well. Wearing one for more than an hour was like simmering your skull in a teapot of sadness. But if you took it off, you revealed a true horror, a hairline devastated by sweat oil and fleas performing aerial manoeuvres. And speaking of heads, beards and hair often got trapped in the fur collars of cloaks, leading to unexpected pain, and occasionally yanking a noble backward mid-strut. Dignity evaporated. Pride turned to panic. You could look like a god until your beard got caught in your fox-trimmed hood, and you screeched like a cursed violin. Let's not ignore the environmental toll. Forests were stripped of animals to meet fur demands. Trappers' overhunted species vanished and entire regions suffered ecological collapse, all so some earl could wrap his knees in mink. Imagine destroying a forest ecosystem because your ankles felt underdressed. It's hard to find a metaphor more medieval than that. And for all this effort, for all the money, blood, sweat and literal tears, what did they get? Skin infections, overheating, flea bites in private places, and the constant nagging itch of knowing your robe cost more than your neighbour's farm and still made you smell like warm trash. Fashion was pain, nobility was damp, and wealth was one long, scratchy disappointment. So the next time you see a fur coat in a museum and think, wow, that looks regal, just remember, that thing was probably a hot box of disease, bad decisions and crushed rodent dreams. The nobles wore their wealth like armour, but that armour came with teeth. Fur was status. Fur was beauty. But above all, fur was suffering with a fancy hem. Imagine getting arrested for wearing the wrong pants. No, really, imagine a full-grown adult in armour pulling you aside and yelling, "Excuse me, sir, are those unauthorised burgundy breeches? Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval sumptuary laws, legal fashion rules designed to remind poor people they were in fact poor." Because nothing screams justice like a royal decree saying peasants can't wear purple unless they're dying in it. These laws weren't just about clothing, they were about control. The nobles needed a way to visually separate themselves from the unwashed masses, and since hygiene couldn't do the job, they turned to fabric and colour. If you were a peasant, your clothing palette was dirt, dust and despair. Browns, greys, maybe a faded blue if God smiled on your sheep that year. Anything brighter, illegal. Literally. You could be fined or worse for dressing above your station. Let's talk about purple. Royalty loved it. Why? Because purple dye came from crushing thousands of sea snails, fermenting their bodies, and then soaking fabric in the resulting goo. It was expensive, rare, and smelled like a corpse's armpit. Perfect for a king. Wearing purple without a title was basically medieval cosplay, except you didn't get kicked out of a convention, you got flogged in the town square. And then there was red. A vibrant, bold colour symbolising powerlust and wealth, which meant only the rich could legally wear it. Even specific shades had rules. Crimson reserved for nobility. Scarlet, maybe the clergy. Brick red A, maybe if you were middle class and feeling lucky. Peasants back to brown. Always brown. If your clothes accidentally turn red from beet juice, you better hope your alibi was airtight. Sumptuary laws didn't stop at colour. They dictated fabric ornamentation, even how long your sleeves could be. Yes, sleeve length was a matter of law. Excessively long sleeves were considered luxurious. Some nobles dragged theirs on the ground like fancy mop handles. If a peasant dared to mimic the look, they were fined or shamed. You there, that sleeve reaches your knee to the stocks, because nothing protects social order like arresting people for their cuffs. And don't get any ideas about fur. We've already established it was a flea circus, but nobles still clung to it like status armour. Sumptuary laws stated that only certain classes could wear specific types of fur. Ermine was for royalty, squirrel was for lower nobles, rabbit maybe if you were a middle class on a budget. Everyone else enjoy your goat wool and the lingering scent of mediocrity. Even accessories were policed. Gold thread pearls, embroidered edges. If your outfit shimmered too much, you'd better have a title and a scroll proving it. Some regions even restricted belt buckles. Belt buckles. Imagine being pulled over for accessorizing too confidently. You there. That clasp is too shiny off with your fashion sense. Women got the worst of it. Noble women were expected to wear expensive clothes to reflect their husband's power. But middle-class women who dressed too well, threats to social stability. Their fashion was seen as seductive, sinful and disruptive. There were actual laws banning excessive adornment in women's hair and garments. Translation, if you looked too good, you were probably corrupting society and someone's husband. And guess what? These laws were constantly updated. Every time merchants made more money or tailors got creative, the nobles panicked. They're dressing like us. We must legislate harder. So they wrote new laws banning the next popular colour, the next popular cut, the next poor person, trying to feel like a human being. It was a never-ending war on fashion equality. Of course, enforcement was laughable. Most local authorities were too busy avoiding the plague or extorting bread from villagers. But when enforcement did happen, it was brutal. Clothes were confiscated. Offenders were fined heavily, often more than their annual income. Repeat offenders could be publicly shamed, whipped or imprisoned, all because they dared to wear a hat with feathers, a literal feather crime. The irony, nobles often flaunted these rules themselves. Royal families broke sumptuary laws constantly. But since they made the laws, they also conveniently ignored them. Hypocrisy in fashion. Who could have guessed? Meanwhile, a baker's apprentice got dragged into court for wearing a tunic with too many buttons. And speaking of buttons, yes, they were regulated too. Buttons were expensive, so having too many was considered ostentatious. Some cities limited how many buttons you could wear based on your income. Imagine someone counting your buttons before letting you into a church. 1, 2? Oh no, you're a cobbler. That's 6 buttons too many. Eternal damnation for you. But these laws weren't just about appearances, they were about fear. The upper class feared the rising merchant class. They feared social mobility. If a wealthy merchant dressed like a baron, how could anyone tell who to bow to chaos dogs marrying cats? So they weaponized clothing. A velvet glove hiding the iron fist of class warfare. And it worked. For centuries, clothing was the medieval caste system. You didn't just wear your place in society, you were trapped in it, stitched into it, fined for questioning it. Even in death, the poor were buried in plain shrouds while the rich got embroidered grave clothes and fur-lined coffins. Because nothing says humility before God like showing off your wealth in the afterlife. So the next time someone tells you fashion doesn't matter, remind them that medieval people literally risked imprisonment for wearing the wrong pants. That peasants were beaten for dressing too nicely. That colour, fabric and style were all coded in law not to express yourself, but to suppress yourself. Dressing well wasn't self-care, it was treason. And as you stand in front of your closet, overwhelmed by choices, just remember having the freedom to wear whatever shade of blue you want without getting arrested is a modern miracle. Sumptuary laws died so your outfit could live. If you thought medieval sumptuary laws were petty, buckle up, because colour-coding the poor was society's way of saying we see you and we still don't want to see you. In a world already built on rigid class structures, medieval elites decided that poverty needed branding. Literal, visible, earth-toned branding. Your job status and worth were all stitched into the shade of your tunic. Forget resumes or personality. You were judged by how depressing your clothes looked from 50 paces away. Brown, grey, off-white, dirt tan. These weren't fashion choices, they were mandates. Poor people wore the colours of things that had already dyed soil ash dust and regret. Not because they liked it, because bright dye was expensive, and owning colour was legally and financially out of reach. If you showed up wearing something remotely vibrant, you might as well scream I'm committing class treason. The rich wore emerald. The poor wore compost. Why so strict? Because colour meant something. Yellow was for prostitutes in many towns. Red might be for executioners. Green sometimes marked servants or low-status workers. The poor didn't choose these colours, they were assigned them like uniforms of shame. If you were unlucky enough to be in a profession that required identification, you had to wear a badge, a patch, or a designated hue to alert society you were definitely not worth talking to. Medieval colour theory wasn't about aesthetics, it was surveillance, and let's not sugarcoat it. These rules were often enforced with cruelty. Bakers had to wear blue in some towns, butchers green, prostitutes, often striped garments so no one could accidentally treat them like a human. Beggars were required to wear patches showing their ailments as if the pus wasn't obvious enough. It wasn't enough to suffer, you had to be labelled too. Colour wasn't just visual, it was punishment. Even pilgrims had a dress code. Those walking to holy sites were required to wear identifying marks, usually a scallop shell or a coloured badge so they wouldn't be confused with vagrants. But once their journey ended, off with the shell or risk arrest. Because if you weren't actively on your way to kiss a relic, you were just another smelly traveller in tattered rags and no one had time for that. Colour was temporary privilege. And let's talk fabric. Not only were the poor stuck with sad colours, they were limited to the worst materials. Unbleached wool, coarse hemp, rough linen if they were lucky. These fabrics didn't take dye well anyway, which was just another excuse to keep the poor looking like walking dust clouds. Your tunic screamed, I eat roots for breakfast, even if you dreamed of something better. But the ultimate insult, poor people were expected to embrace this aesthetic. Modesty was a virtue. Simplicity meant you weren't vain. Humble clothing was considered holy. So if you were poor and miserable, congrats, you were also spiritually fashionable. Meanwhile, nobles in gold-threaded doublets just shrugged and called it God's will that you dressed like a potato sack. Colour coding wasn't just social control, it was gaslighting. And heaven help you if you tried to rebel. Imagine a peasant sneaking into a market wearing a deep blue tunic he'd dyed himself with crushed berries and lies. The moment he walked past a merchant, it was over. He'd be called out, dragged before the guild and fined for offensive imitation of nobility. That was an actual accusation in some places. Offensive imitation. As if wearing indigo was a personal attack on the monarchy. Now were there loopholes? Sure. A few clever tailors learned to mix herbs and mud to tint fabric subtly. Some peasants darkened their clothes with smoke or animal fat just to look less like walking resignation. But it wasn't fashion. It was survival. A desperate attempt to reclaim dignity with a half-burnt cloak and a prayer that nobody noticed it had a suspicious burgundy tint. Let's not forget the church's role in all this. Clergy encouraged poor people to find peace in their station, which is rich considering many bishops wore robes dyed with cochineal insects and imported silk. They'd lecture peasants on humility while glittering like a Christmas ornament in a candlelit sermon. Medieval spiritual guidance boiled down to be proud of your brown tunic. God loves you more if you're ugly. Even artists participated. Medieval illustrations often depicted poor people in drab hues, while painting saints and nobles in vibrant glowing robes. Manuscripts practically glowed with gold leaf halos and scarlet cloaks. Meanwhile, the background peasants were beige, featureless, and often hunched. This wasn't accidental. It was propaganda. A visual reminder that colourful people were important, and everyone else was background noise. Children didn't escape either. Poor kids wore hand-me-downs of already faded garments. They ran through fields in greyish rags that had seen more winters than they had birthdays. A noble child might have a miniature tunic in pale green or crimson. A peasant child got mud. Actual mud. Sometimes that was the outfit. And guess who got called unruly and wild in court records, not the child in silk slippers, This kind of enforced dullness went beyond shame. It killed ambition. If you grew up seeing colour as forbidden, you stopped dreaming about it. You didn't imagine wearing blue, or green, or gold. You imagined getting through the day without getting fined. Fashion was never about self-expression. It was about surviving a visual caste system designed to keep you invisible unless someone needed firewood chopped. And the irony. The dyes themselves weren't even magic. Red came from madder root, blue from woad, yellow from weld. These were plants you could grow, but growing them controlled, selling them regulated, buying the dye priced like unicorn tears. If you tried to DIY your own colour, the dye guilds would hunt you down like a fabric witch. Peasants weren't just colourless. They were criminalised for wanting to be otherwise. Fast forward a few centuries and we romanticise these clothes. Reenactors in beige tunics twirl around maypoles and call it charming. Costume dramas dress their background extras in tasteful browns and call it authentic. But real medieval poor people didn't feel quaint. They felt erased. Their clothes were itchy reminders that they didn't matter. Their colourlessness wasn't aesthetic. It was punishment stitched into every seam. So next time you throw on a bright yellow hoodie or a pair of deep green joggers, take a moment. You're wearing colours that used to get people fined, beaten or socially erased. Your neon beanie is a tiny revolution. Your tie-dye is freedom. And your ability to wear purple without begging the king's forgiveness, that's progress, baby. Colour-coding the poor wasn't about fashion, it was about fear. And in the Middle Ages, nothing scared the rich more than a well-dressed peasant with confidence. If you've ever complained about breaking in a new pair of sneakers, imagine slipping your feet into medieval footwear, aka wood leather and suffering. Shoes back then weren't about comfort. They were about not slicing your feet open on rocks. That's it. Arch support non-existent. Insoles dream on. Style only if your idea of fashion involves open blisters and toe fungus you can name. Let's begin with the basics. Medieval shoes were mostly made of leather, but not the soft, buttery kind you find in a luxury handbag. No, this was untreated, stiff, crusty leather, essentially tanned cowhide that felt like walking on cured beef jerky. And if you were poor, congratulations, you didn't even get that. You wore wooden clogs strapped to your feet with ropes or animal sinew. Comfort was for nobles and people who died quickly. The most common design was a turnshoe, a softish leather slipper sewn inside out and flipped after stitching. They looked like socks if socks hated you. These things had no left or right designation. You just shoved your foot in and hoped for the best. No support, no shape, and definitely no protection from weather or sharp things. Step on a nail, that's Tuesday. Welcome to tetanus country. And then there were pattens. O'Patton's wooden platforms strapped over regular shoes to lift you out of the mud and human waste flooding every medieval street. Walking in pattens required the balance of a tightrope walker and the blind trust of someone who's never heard the phrase ankle sprain. They clacked with every step, sounded like you were being followed by a coconut horse, and guaranteed that one wrong move sent you skating into a pile of medieval regret. You'd think rich people had it better, right? Think again. Noble footwear was fancier, not smarter. Pointy-toed shoes called poulaines became all the rage. These things were so long they had to be tied to the knees with ribbons to stop you from tripping over your own fashion sense. The longer the toe, the higher your status. Some nobles had tips extending over 2 feet long. Practicality. 0. But elegance. Well, nothing says grace like dragging your toes like a fishing line through sewage. But poulaines weren't just ridiculous, they were dangerous. The extended toe could catch on stairs' door frames or angry villagers. Tripping was common, falling was inevitable. Nobles broke ankles trying to strut through castles, which might explain the abundance of medieval canes and suspicious limps in old portraits. There's a reason these shoes eventually got banned by the church, and several city councils. Fashion should not require medical attention. Weather naturally laughed in the face of medieval footwear. Rain turned leather shoes into swampy nightmares. Snow, good luck. There were no waterproof linings, no thermal soles, no grip. Just cold, wet feet wrapped in frozen cow skin. People often stuffed straw or cloth into their shoes just to survive the walk to market. By midwinter, those shoes smelled like mildew, toe rot, and quiet suffering. And don't even get us started on socks. There weren't any. Not unless you were rich enough to have a woolen foot wrap or a linen bandage you tied around your feet like a sad toga party. Most peasants went barefoot in warmer months, and wore the same cracked, soggy shoes until they disintegrated. Your feet were either exposed to the elements or marinating in them. Either way, you were always one step away from trench foot. Shoe repair. An ongoing nightmare. Cobblers existed, but they were overworked and underpaid, and most of their clients just patched things with thread-bone needles and existential dread. If the sole wore out, you didn't replace it. You nailed another piece of leather to the bottom and hoped for a miracle. There are actual surviving shoes from the 14th century with 5 or 6 layers of desperate repairs. Medieval orthopedics was basically stack leather until your foot gives up. And speaking of feet giving up, let's talk infections. Blisters turned to abscesses, cuts turned septic. People lost toes, entire feet. Gangrene was a fashion accessory nobody wanted. In a world without antibiotics or proper sanitation, one bad shoe day could lead to a lifetime of hobbling or worse. Some nobles had gold-threaded shoes covering blackened, rotting toes. But hey, at least the embroidery matched the gout. Of course, the church had opinions. Monks often went barefoot as a sign of humility which looked noble in theory and fungal in practice. They walked on cold stone mud and holy bacteria while preaching about spiritual poverty. Meanwhile, their infected souls left footprints of faith across monastery floors. Nothing says devotion like bleeding on your way to matins. And then there were executioners. Yes, they had specific footwear too. Heavy boots sometimes reinforced with iron because nothing ruins a dramatic beheading like slipping on a wet platform. These boots were probably the most practical shoes in the medieval wardrobe, which makes sense. If your job involves standing in blood, you want traction. Let's not forget children. Peasant kids didn't wear shoes unless they were dying or being baptized. Their feet toughened up like leather over time, covered in calluses and scars from climbing rocks, running through thorny fields and kicking livestock in self-defense. Childhood wasn't barefoot because it was cute. It was barefoot because shoes were too expensive to waste on someone who might outgrow them in a month or die of dysentery first. And in case you thought shoemaking was glamorous, it absolutely wasn't. Cobblers worked in dark, damp stalls with toxic glue-sharp tools and the stench of rotting hides. They stitched until their fingers bled, breathed in fumes, bent over for hours a day. The result, shoes that barely functioned, barely fit, and absolutely hated you. You wore them because you had to, not because your feet deserved kindness. Fashion changed slowly and comfort was never the goal. When shoe styles evolved, it was because some king declared that curved toes were out and square ones were in not, because people asked for better arch support. Innovation came in the form of new ways to hurt your feet, not new ways to protect them. Even the invention of heels didn't help. They were designed for stirrups, not sidewalks. And yes, men wore them first, because who doesn't want to twist an ankle while asserting dominance? So next time you slip into your cushioned ergonomic arch-supported sneakers and sigh because the lace is slightly uneven, take a moment. Remember the peasants who wore shoes made of wet bark, the nobles who tripped over their own fashion choices, the children who never knew socks, and the cobblers who cursed every foot they ever met. Because in the Middle Ages, shoes weren't about walking in style, they were about walking at all. Let's talk about medieval hats, because nothing says, please avoid me, like wearing a sweaty cone of wool on your lice-ridden scalp. Hats in the Middle Ages weren't just about fashion. They were functional, symbolic, and most importantly strategic head-based stink shields. In a world where people washed their hair once per lunar eclipse, the hat was your best friend, worst enemy, and a walking confession that things were not okay up there. Think of it as a medieval air freshener with fleas. For peasants, the go-to hat was the coif, a simple linen hood that tied under the chin like a very sad baby bonnet. It was supposed to protect your head from dirt and sun, but mostly it protected other people from your hair. Because underneath that coif grease, not the musical, the actual slick, flammable substance. Hair wasn't just unwashed, it was weaponized. The coif was the only thing standing between your neighbour and a full sensory assault. Then came the felt hats. Thick, itchy, and moulded by hand from wool and sweat, these hats had the texture of a boiled sponge and the smell of a damp cave. Peasants wore them in the fields to keep their heads from baking, and because straw was no longer an acceptable substitute after the plague years, they were often shaped like buckets, mushrooms, or overturned flower pots. Why? Because the fashion industry hadn't been invented yet, and practicality beat aesthetics every time unless your head caught fire near a torch. And you'd think the nobles had it better, but oh no. Rich people just made their headwear taller, heavier, and more absurd. Enter the hennin, the iconic cone hat worn by noble women that looked like an ice cream cone glued to the scalp. Sometimes they were so tall they had to be anchored with wire and prayer. Topped with flowing veils, they were majestic from afar. Up close, sweat-stained torture towers harbouring lice with a superiority complex. Men weren't immune. They wore chaperons, looped and layered hoods that evolved into turban-like fashion statements. Originally a simple hood with a cape, the chaperon got twisted into artful chaos by nobles trying to outdo each other in the I have too much money category. The result, hats that looked like a pretzel mated with a towel, and every one of them sat on top of a scalp that hadn't seen soap since the last harvest festival. You see, hats served multiple purposes in the Middle Ages. They were protection, identity, and olfactory defence systems. A hat signalled your trade, your class, your marital status, and unintentionally your level of scalp infestation. Take the beretta, a square cap worn by clergy. It said I serve God and possibly have ringworm. Or the academic cap worn by scholars and students, which said I know Latin and also haven't bathed in weeks. Even beggars had hat codes, wide-brimmed, often patched, and sometimes with bells or tags to indicate illness or spiritual service. Their hats were not just hats, they were warning signs. Do not approach. Contents may be contagious. If modern hats say cool or stylish medieval hats screamed I'm full of secrets and possibly roaches, but the greatest unspoken truth of medieval hats, they trapped everything. Heat, lice, odour and sin. Once a hat was on, it rarely came off. Hair was rarely washed, but heads still sweated, especially in crowded halls, hot fields, or under stress like trying to walk through a door with a 2-foot hennin and a side veil dragging behind you. Hats absorbed everything and then became part of your body odour profile. You didn't wear a hat, you fused with it. And cleaning them don't make me laugh. Most hats weren't cleaned. They were brushed off, maybe scented with herbs and called good enough. A noble might sprinkle their cone hat with lavender. A monk might wave incense near his hood. A peasant might beat his felt cap against a wall and call it laundry. The lice didn't care. They built fortresses and passed the hat down through generations. And if you ever lost your hat, oh boy, that wasn't just inconvenient. It was humiliating. Hats were your identity. No hat, no class, no credibility. You might as well walk around naked. In fact, in some regions, being seen in public without a hat was a punishable offence. It meant disrespect, madness, or worse, being mistaken for someone lower than your already miserable station. Medieval status anxiety brought to you by headwear. Of course the church had its opinions. Surprised they hated everything fun. Hats that were too tall, prideful. Hats that covered too much hair, suspicious. Hats that sparkled, vanity. Monks and nuns were expected to keep their headwear, humble, simple hoods, black veils, minimal decoration. But even then those fabrics collected sweat like sinners collect guilt. By the end of a pilgrimage, a monk's cowl could stand up by itself and recite the Psalms through sheer smell alone. Then there were the executioner hoods. Yes, real thing. Black dramatic and meant to conceal identity, not for the safety of the executioner, but because no one wanted to know which sweaty man just chopped off their cousin's head. These hoods were heavy hot and saturated with the scent of fear, blood, and leftover onions from the night before. They were both tool and curse, and fashion kept escalating. Some nobles wore hats so wide they couldn't fit through doors. Others balanced metal bands on their heads because nothing says status like a mild concussion. There were fur-trimmed caps worn indoors, feathered caps that looked like they murdered a bird mid-flight, even antler hats for ceremonies because apparently forest chic was in. The rule was simple. If it looked ridiculous and made you dizzy, it meant you were important. But here's the kicker. None of these hats made people smell better. They just hid the problem. Medieval society didn't solve hygiene, it accessorized around it. Do I smell? Yes. But look at this hat. Look at its majesty. Look how tall it is. It was misdirection. Like hanging a chandelier over a clogged toilet and calling it luxury. So yes, medieval hats were ridiculous. They were absurd, impractical, and often biologically hostile. But they were also necessary because they covered your secrets, your sweat, your lice, your station in life. And in a society where looking clean was more important than being clean, the hat became your halo, your armour, your silent scream. Next time you throw on a baseball cap to hide a bad hair day, be grateful. You're not tying a pointed silk cone to your scalp with pins and peasant tears. You're not hiding fleas in felt. And you're definitely not warning others that your head is a medieval disaster zone. In short, medieval hats said, "Don't talk to me, I smell," and everyone understood. Think full plate armour made you a badass. Sure, if your idea of badass includes slow cooking yourself like a medieval pot roast in the middle of July. Knights weren't just warriors, they were walking Dutch ovens. These guys didn't charge into battle, they waddled. Slowly, sweating like a ham in a sauna, all while pretending it was an honour to suffocate in 60 pounds of metal. Now before you romanticize it, let's talk about the smell. Under all that glimmering steel was a layer of padded linen called a gambeson. Sounds fancy, right? It was basically a quilt soaked in old sweat blood and other fluids that shall not be named. You know how your gym bag smells after a week in the trunk? Multiply that by medieval hygiene, and you're getting close. Medieval warfare didn't wait for pleasant weather. Battles happened in rain, mud, or under the scorching sun, and metal armour, it doesn't breathe. It traps heat like a greenhouse built by Satan. Some knights collapsed from heat stroke before even drawing a sword. Imagine dying not from battle wounds, but from playing dress-up in a metallic oven. And did you know knights needed help? Just to put the stuff on a full suit took about 10-15 minutes with assistance. If you think wearing shapewear is a struggle, try climbing into a tin can with someone else tightening it, like your life depends on it. Because it did, unless you passed out first. The padding underneath was meant to prevent bruising and blisters. Spoiler, it didn't. The pressure points excruciating, the chafing biblical. Men came out of armour not like victorious heroes, but like peeled potatoes, red raw and slightly damp, sexy right. If a knight fell on his back, he might need a crane to get up. Seriously, that I've fallen and I can't get up meme started with chainmail. Armour didn't just restrict your movement, it transformed battle into a slow-motion metallic ballet of exhaustion. Graceful, no entertaining to watch. Absolutely. Armour was wildly expensive. It was a symbol of wealth, privilege, and probable death by dehydration. Poorer soldiers wore partial armour, if any, and still ended up sweaty, miserable, and dead. The best-case scenario, living long enough to develop a fungal infection under your armpits. Worst case, impaled and roasted. Also, visibility laughable. Helmets were like medieval VR headsets, except instead of immersing you in fantasy, they immersed you in darkness, tinnitus, and mild panic. Breathing was a luxury, seeing the enemy optional. They hoped the loud clanging would scare foes away. Subtle intimidation, medieval style. And here's the kicker: armour didn't make you invincible. A strong arrow, a well-placed dagger, or just falling off your horse could end your life. Because while armour protected you from swords, it didn't protect you from gravity. Knights drowned crossing rivers because armour turns you into a very shiny rock. Sink and die, noble sir. Still think you'd survive the Middle Ages? Try standing in the sun for an hour in a baking sheet taped to your body. Then add 0 hydration, 0 sunscreen, and a 30% chance someone's trying to kill you. Congratulations, you're halfway to being a medieval knight. Add lice and you're there. Oh, and remember jousting 2 guys on horses charging at each other in full armour. It wasn't glorious. It was 2 heat-exhausted men barely hanging on, praying they'd just fall off and get a break. Sometimes they broke ribs. Sometimes they broke reality. A direct hit to the head wasn't just painful, it was a medieval reboot. Today's cosplay warriors might dress up for Comic Cons, but medieval knights dressed up to die. There's something poetically stupid about that. At least modern humans can take their helmets off for a snack break. Knights. They were snack breaks for other knights. So next time you complain about your summer outfit being too warm, imagine medieval soldiers layering hot fabric, then hot metal, then hot failure. And no, they didn't have gold bond powder. They had prayers and pustules. Forget cute overalls, superhero pajamas, or anything remotely child-appropriate. Medieval peasant kids wore the exact same rags as their parents, just smaller and usually dirtier. Childhood wasn't a whimsical chapter of a life. It was basically an unpaid internship in human survival. If you could walk, you could work. And if you could talk, you were probably yelling, "I'm cold." There was no such thing as kids' wear in the 14th century. No aisles of colourful clothing, no tiny boots shaped like animals. Nope. It was tunic smocks, or if they were lucky, some stitched-together potato sack that didn't itch too much. These weren't clothes designed for play. They were scratchy uniforms issued by poverty itself. Most of the time, children went barefoot, through mud-dung snow and whatever fermented horror medieval roads offered that day. The idea was that kids were tough and didn't need shoes. The reality: infections, frostbite and soles tougher than boiled leather. If you saw a kid with shoes, congratulations, you'd spotted royalty. Or theft. And let's not ignore the lice. If lice had a favourite snack, it was the scalp of a medieval child. No haircuts, no soap, no mercy. Kids were walking buffets for parasites. Forget baby lotion. These little humans were crusty cranky, and covered in whatever had crawled out of the local compost heap. Girls and boys wore nearly the same outfits because gender didn't matter when survival was the priority. A shapeless tunic. Perfect. Is it clean? Of course not. It was washed only when it could walk off on its own. Medieval laundry day was less about cleanliness and more about surrender. But what really made peasant children look like mini-adults was how much they worked. Herding goats, fetching water, babysitting younger siblings who were somehow always sticky, all while being dressed like tiny depressed monks. There was no break. No school unless you were rich. And certainly no playdates unless you count digging in filth with a stick. The worst part, hand-me-downs. Except these weren't cute vintage hand-me-downs with charm. They were shredded, stained, half-decayed garments held together by desperation and maybe a rat or two. Wearing your dead sibling's clothes was considered lucky. You had a full outfit and a haunting reminder stitched into every thread. Winter was a nightmare. No thermal underwear, no coats, just layers of wool if you had it, and if not, just hug your own shivering body and hope for the best. A cold snap could wipe out entire families, especially children. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's just Tuesday in medieval January. And forget diapers. Babies were often wrapped in swaddling bands so tight you'd think they were training to become sausages. When the bands came off, let's just say the smell was a medieval birthright. Changing nappies wasn't a task. It was an act of spiritual fortitude best done outside with a stiff drink. Older children were often indistinguishable from the adults in their village, just shorter and usually dirtier. The concept of teenagers didn't exist. You went from toddler to field worker in one brutal transition. Puberty didn't mean rebellion. It meant picking up a heavier bucket. To make things worse, most clothing wasn't even made for them. It was adult-sized rags cut down with a knife and a prayer. Ill-fitting, uncomfortable, and usually falling off one shoulder. Which, by the way, was also the shoulder that got sunburned, frozen, or gnawed on by fleas. And let's not forget the ceremonial outfits, because yes, even poor kids had to show up looking respectable for church or a wedding. This usually meant putting on the least filthy tunic and maybe combing their hair with fingers that just cleaned a pig pen. Presentation mattered, even if the smell screamed otherwise. So next time you see a child whining about the Wi-Fi being slow, remember this medieval peasant children didn't have toys, education or shoes. They had one job, don't die. And they performed that role dressed like tiny tragic clones of their parents. Cute maybe. Traumatizing definitely. Getting dressed in the Middle Ages was less morning routine and more daily joust with fabric. Imagine waking up in a cold, damp room, your breath visible in the air, and knowing the first task of your day is to wrestle a wool tunic over your head without dislocating a shoulder. There's no elastic, no zippers, and certainly no stretchy waistband in sight. Just layers of heavy hand-stitched fabric that fit like a particularly judgmental potato sack. Putting on clothes wasn't about expression. It was about survival. And often it felt like your outfit was actively trying to murder you. Start with the basics, your linen shirt. Scratchy yellowed and vaguely damp, it clung to the body like a needy ghost. Next came the chauces, tight-fitting leg tubes tied to your underbelt, the medieval equivalent of skinny jeans sewn shut by a sadist. You'd twist, hop, curse and pray just to get one leg in, then repeat for the second. It's no surprise they called it dressing. It felt like being attacked. Buttonholes were rare. Most clothes were tied, laced or pinned, because nothing says cosy like sharp metal near your flesh. And if you were upper class, oh, you sweet summer surf, welcome to the Fashion Olympics. Layers upon layers stitched to perfection by someone who definitely hated you. A noblewoman's dress might weigh more than a small sheep, and that's before adding her surcoat girdle fur trimming and 3 pounds of jewellery. Getting dressed required assistance, which sounds glamorous until you remember your maid was also wiping your backside yesterday. There was no privacy, no modesty, and absolutely no quick trips to the privy. Men didn't fare better. A fashionable knight might wear a linen undershirt, woolen hose, doublet cote hardy, and a hooded cloak so stiff it could double as body armour. Belts crisscrossed like some kind of sad bondage performance, and codpieces made everything worse. You couldn't sit without rearranging your entire pelvic architecture, and heaven help you. If you sneezed while lacing your boots, your spine might never recover. Sartorial choices weren't about comfort. They were status traps stitched by masochists. Removing these clothes wasn't just take it off, it was a negotiation. Laces tangled, pins vanished. Wool clung to sweat-soaked skin like a mouldy second soul. If your fingers were numb from cold or arthritis or sheer despair, good luck. Removing your tunic might require a friend, a servant, or divine intervention. And if you had buttons, real buttons, you were either rich or a wizard. But God help you if one popped off mid-undressing. That thing was gone forever, down the rushes, into oblivion. Underwear or what passed for it only made things worse. Most people didn't wear anything under their chausses except hope, and those who did had Bray's baggy linen shorts tied with a string. Picture parachutes, but sadder. Taking them off meant untying a knot that had been sweating against your hips all day. Sometimes the knot had fused into the fabric. You'd pull, it wouldn't budge, you'd curse, still nothing. By the end your fingers would be bleeding and the string still unyielding, as if your pants had developed Stockholm syndrome. Want to go to bed? Not so fast. Your nightshirt, if you had one, smelled like soup. That's because everything smelled like soup. Also, most people just slept in their clothes. All of them. because removing layers meant dealing with the horrific reality of your own hygiene. It was easier to sleep in filth than confront it. And honestly, who had the energy to reverse the morning's torture just to freeze all night? Blankets were luxury items. Clothes were warmth. Clothes were your last defense against the fleas. And let's talk about sweat. Sweat soaked into every layer like medieval cologne. Laundry wasn't a daily thing, it was a quarterly gamble. And washing wool was a war crime. You didn't wash a tunic, you punished it. First beat it with a stick, then scrub it with urine. Finally dry it in smoke. Congratulations, you've invented the scent of the Middle Ages' smoke, piss and despair. No wonder people were reluctant to take anything off. Their clothes might fall apart, or worse, revolt. By the 14th century, some rich folks hired dressers, not furniture, but humans, whose full-time job was to handle these clothing crises. Imagine being paid to lace someone's sleeves and then wait around all day to unlatch their medieval straitjacket. It was like being a tailor therapist and hostage negotiator in one. Nobles had changing rooms, peasants had open fields. Either way, dressing was a team sport, and undressing. That was a post-battle clean-up operation. Even armour was easier. At least knights knew they needed help getting into it. Everyday clothing pretended to be wearable but behaved like booby-trapped luggage. And if your clothes got wet, game over. Wool shrinks, linen stretches, everything sticks. Removing soaked medieval garments was the full medieval cleanse, equal parts pain and penance. You'd end up naked, chafed and shivering, wondering if being cold was better than being clothed. But the real tragedy? No one questioned it. They just accepted it, like they accepted tooth rot and divine punishment. That's how it always is, we suffer. Then rationalise. Clothing is modest. Layers are protection. This lace is decorative. Sure. And so is that festering sore on your thigh. Truth is medieval fashion wasn't a statement, it was a scream muffled by wool. A cry for help, dressed in linen and tied with a shoelace. So next time you zip up a hoodie or kick off your sneakers without pulling a muscle, take a moment. Remember that someone in 1374 needed a squire just to remove their socks. Getting dressed was exercise. Getting undressed was surgery. And for the lucky few with buttons, life was still pain but slightly more stylish. Bathing in the Middle Ages was like a choose-your-own-adventure game, except every choice led to a rash, a fever, or death by lice rebellion. If you think medieval people were running steaming baths scented with lavender oil, think again. More often it was a shared wooden tub filled with lukewarm swamp tea, possibly reheated from last week's royal foot soak. Public bathhouses were the social equivalent of modern spas, if spas were filled with naked strangers, questionable attendance and the looming possibility of syphilis. Welcome to medieval hygiene where getting clean could leave you permanently unclean. Let's talk water first. Clean water was a fantasy like dragons, except more useful. Most towns dumped their waste into the same rivers they drew water from, which meant your bath was basically a soup of excrement, dead rats, and last night's sins. And people knew this. They could smell it. But they still bathed. Why? Because filth was constant, and at some point even gross water seemed like an upgrade from your own skin stench. It's the historical equivalent of Febreze doesn't clean, it just masks it with something weirder. Now if you had a bit of coin, you might indulge in the stew bathhouses. Don't be fooled by the delicious name. These places were steamy for all the wrong reasons. Men and women bathed together, chatted, ate, and let's be honest, engaged in extracurricular activities. It was less about getting clean, and more about medieval Tinder in a wooden tub. And just like today's dating apps, diseases spread like wildfire. Except instead of ghosting, people got boils! Lots of them. And speaking of diseases, enter the plague. When it arrived, bathing was immediately thrown under the cart. People thought hot water opened the pores, making it easier for bad air to sneak in and kill you softly. So they did what any panicked population would do, they stopped bathing. all together, for years. You think skipping a shower for 2 days is edgy? Try skipping for a decade, then wondering why your skin itches like it's auditioning for a horror film. Spoiler, it's the fleas. It's always the fleas. The church in its infinite and very sweaty wisdom wasn't helping. Bathing was seen as vanity, a gateway to sin. Scrubbing your armpits became a suspicious activity. Priests preached that cleanliness was next to godlessness, and naturally the people complied. After all, who needs soap when you have salvation, dirty bodies, pure souls? That was the brand. And it stank. Literally. And here's the kicker, when people did bathe, they often reused water, as in entire households shared the same bath water, starting with the patriarch, of course, and ending with the baby. By the time little Thomas climbed in, the water looked like it had fought in a war and lost. That's actually where the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" comes from. Because you genuinely couldn't see him in there. He was camouflaged in the sludge of medieval affection and someone's toe fungus. Soap. Oh, you mean lye, goat fat and ash mashed together in a rough bar that doubled as a weapon. That's what passed for soap in many places. Using it was like exfoliating with a brick dipped in sadness. Rich people had fancier versions with herbs, perfumes and the tears of peasants. But even then it wasn't cleansing so much as smearing sweet-smelling grime over bitter grime. A 2-layered dirt parfait. Even the act of drying off was risky. Towels were rare luxuries, so you either drip-dried in a drafty room and caught pneumonia, or rubbed yourself down with whatever cloth-like object was nearby. An old curtain, a pet, maybe your dignity. And the floor muddy, always muddy. Which meant no matter how clean you got, you walked back to your flea-ridden straw mattress as a slightly wetter version of your old filthy self. Progress. And yet somehow people survived this. Not well, not healthily, but they survived. There was even a bath-related job title, the bathhouse boy, whose duties included refilling tubs, scrubbing backs, and no joke checking clients for lice. Imagine waking up one day and realising your job is officially bug patrol for damp, naked strangers. And now you know why turnover rates were high and enthusiasm was low. So next time you're soaking in a bubble bath with cucumber slices on your eyes, take a moment to thank the gods of plumbing privacy and personal hygiene. Because once upon a time a bath wasn't relaxing. It was a social experiment in how many diseases could fit in one tub. And the answer was all of them. If you think today's fashion is dangerous high heels, corsets, TikTok challenges involving glue, allow me to reintroduce medieval style where getting dressed was basically a death wish, wrapped in wool and sprayed with rat poison. You didn't wear fashion, you survived it. Imagine pulling on a tunic that was dyed with mercury, then tossing on a lead-laced hat to complete the look. Slay. They did. In a very literal funerary sense. Let's start with colours. Vibrant hues were all the rage among the elite, but those colours didn't come from some cruelty-free organic plant-based Etsy store. No, they came from heavy metals and arsenic. Want to wear a rich green? That meant arsenic dye, which sounds like a science experiment gone wrong, because it was. It absorbed into the skin over time, slowly poisoning its fashionable victim. People literally died in style. He died doing what he loved, looking wealthy. But wait, what about the beautiful red and orange tones worn by high clergy and royalty? Let's talk about cinnabar. It's mercury sulfide. You grind it up, add it to cloth and boom. Your robe now screams prestige and neurological damage. But you know what they say, if your clothes don't shake your hands, eventually will. That trembling wasn't piety. It was mercury poisoning in its Sunday best. Even the lower classes got their share of accidental fashion fatalities, because who needs breathable fabrics when you can ferment in your own sweat and fungus? Wool was not just itchy, it was moist heavy, and the ideal environment for skin infections. Add in poorly tanned leather boots made with piss and quicklime, and suddenly your outfit is actively attacking your feet. Gangrene isn't just for battlefields, it's for peasants too. Haute couture. Try hot, wet foot rot, And then there was fur. The status symbol of itchy nobility. Fur-lined robes weren't just cosy, they were crawling. Lice, fleas and mites adored fur. They laid eggs in it, lived in it, and waited for your warm flesh to walk by. Wearing fur was basically strapping on a parasite motel. Bonus points if you got the plague. Imagine telling people you caught the Black Death from your ermine collar. Tragic, but classy. Let's not forget about accessories. Buttons were so tight and sharp-edged that they regularly sliced open fingers while fastening them. Fashion victims indeed. Belts made of metal plates or stiffened hide. Great for looking like a knight, not so great when they chafed your hips into raw hamburger. People would wear them tightly because why not add internal organ displacement to your wardrobe's resume? And the shoes. Oh, the shoes. Pointy-toed poulaines that made you trip on cobblestones and fall into open sewers. The longer the point, the higher the status and the lower your chances of walking normally. People literally broke ankles trying to look noble. One gust of wind and down you went like a medieval runway model without a safety net. Full fashion. It was literal. Some rich folks even wore clothes studded with gems and metal bits sewn directly into the fabric, because being stabbed to death by your own wardrobe was a mark of class. One wrong move, and your bejewelled hem impales your thigh. Congratulations, you've just been murdered by embroidery. And yes, corsets existed, though not like in the 18th century. Early forms were more like torture devices than undergarments. They compressed your ribs, cut your breath, and made digestion a theoretical concept. Passing out at church wasn't always due to divine ecstasy. It was because someone's spleen just lost a wrestling match with their girdle. Even hats could kill you. The henny in those tall, pointy hats worn by noblewomen looked elegant, but were so heavy, they gave chronic neck strain. Imagine strapping a traffic cone to your skull and balancing it for 12 hours. Now do it without bathing. Now imagine lice living in the cone. Yes, your scalp was a gothic theme park for vermin. Fashion was a battlefield, but instead of dodging arrows, you were dodging infection poisoning and structural collapse. Imagine dying from a closet malfunction. She died as she lived, being strangled by her own beauty. The sad thing, people knew some of this stuff was dangerous. There were whispers about the dyes, complaints about the skin rashes. But if your lord showed up to the banquet in a shimmering purple tunic, you damn well followed suit or risked looking poor. Better dead than drab. Even perfumes weren't safe. They were made from oils and animal musk, sometimes stabilized with ethanol or lye. You were essentially marinating in toxic soup. But hey, you smelled like money and impending kidney failure. Let's be clear, nobody was safe. From the stinking peasant in his wormy wool to the bishop in his mercury-laced vestments, fashion was a great equalizer. It killed indiscriminately, like a very well-dressed executioner. So next time you get a rash from a polyester t-shirt, don't complain. At least your clothes didn't come with a death certificate and a funeral robe pre-attached. So you've decided to wear pants in public. If you're a man in the 1300s, that just makes you another sweaty leg sausage in itchy wool. But if you're a woman, congratulations, you're now eligible for church condemnation, public shame, and possibly death by social outrage. In the Middle Ages, cross-dressing wasn't just frowned upon, it was basically viewed as medieval witchcraft in fabric form. And let's be clear, we're not talking drag balls or statement pieces. We're talking survival comfort or just not wanting to get your skirt caught in a plough. Joan of Arc burned at the stake officially for heresy, but let's not forget that tiny footnote she wore men's clothes. Apparently God had a fashion police department, and Joan missed the memo. Her trial records obsess more over her outfit than her visions. Medieval courtrooms where wearing breeches was more scandalous than leading an army. Picture this objection. Your Honour, she wore a belt. Gasp. The audacity. Clothing laws weren't just about keeping people in their lane, they were designed to keep you in your birth-assigned silhouette. Male, tunic hose weapon, female, dress veil submission. Cross those gender seams and society came undone faster than a poorly stitched doublet. Even peasants who barely owned more than one outfit were expected to play fashion police on each other. Heaven forbid some desperate farm girl needed to borrow her brother's tunic to avoid freezing her kidneys off. And it wasn't just women cross-dressing who got into trouble. Men dressing as women were seen as not only sinful but dangerously subversive. Forget comedy or performance, this wasn't Monty Python. This was burn the deviant before the crops fail energy. In 1429, a London man named John Rickener was arrested for dressing as a woman and also working as a prostitute. The scandal, not the sex, the clothes. Rickener's interrogation read like a confused tailor trying to write theology. But let's talk hypocrisy. Because, it was thick as wool. Nobles threw masquerade balls with men dressed as ladies and women as knights, and everyone clapped. But let a peasant woman wear trousers to ride a horse, and suddenly it's the apocalypse. Sumptuary laws didn't just tell you what fabric you could afford, they dictated your gender performance. Got breasts, no pants. Got beard, no lace. Mess that up and someone's lighting a torch. The church, unsurprisingly, had opinions. They cited Deuteronomy 22:5 like it was a fabric swatch. A woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man, etc., etc., which might sound old-school conservative until you remember that this was also the same church that dressed monks in robe skirts and told everyone not to question God's taste in linen. Selective enforcement is just another stitch in the grand ecclesiastical tapestry. The irony, in practice some women had to cross-dress to survive. Travelling alone, better not do it in skirts unless you enjoy being robbed and judged. Many widows, poor labourers or female apprentices disguised themselves as men for access to work or safety on the road. They weren't trying to challenge the patriarchy, they were trying to not die. But medieval society didn't care. You wore trousers boom, heretic, or witch, or worse, a fashion rebel. Even plays weren't safe. In England, female actors were banned from the stage, so male actors played every role, including Juliet. Imagine being arrested in real life for something you're paid to do on stage. You'd have more freedom pretending to be a woman than actually being one. The logic flimsy, the punishment brutal, the history sweaty, gendered and sown with fear. In many cities, cross-dressing was equated with deception, and deception was the devil's work. Never mind that you wore men's boots because your frostbitten toes demanded it. Never mind that your husband's death left you the sole provider. If your outfit suggested you were more competent than expected for your sex, well, that was clearly witchcraft. Nothing says male insecurity like making trousers illegal for women. It wasn't all doom and petticoats, though. Some bold figures, usually upper class or very, very sneaky, pushed the lines. Chronicles tell of noble women disguising themselves to join pilgrimages or follow lovers into war, or just because they hated corsets. Did society admire them briefly, until they were found out? Then it was back to public shaming fines or getting tossed into the stocks. Moral of the story, the closet wasn't just metaphorical, it was legal. Fast forward to today where clothing is a form of self-expression and comfort, or just hiding the pizza stains from last night. But in medieval times, fashion was surveillance. Wear the wrong thing, and you weren't just making a statement, you were making enemies. Your tunic wasn't fabric. It was a social contract signed in itchy wool and enforced by angry mobs with pitchforks. So next time you pull on a hoodie, remember there was a time when choosing your outfit meant risking arrest. When a woman in pants was a national scandal. When comfort was rebellion. Cross-dressing in the Middle Ages wasn't just fashion. It was defiance sewn at the seams. And for that, people paid in bloodfire or a long sermon about moral decay and hemlines. If you thought medieval fashion was dictated by kings or queens, you're only half wrong. The real style influencers were robed celibate and terrifyingly obsessed with your ankles. The church didn't just preach humility, it micromanaged it down to the hemline. If your dress was too short, you were a harlot. Too long a proud sinner dragging your sin behind you like a train of damnation. Welcome to 14th century couture brought to you by eternal guilt. Let's start with the basics. Visible skin was a sin. Yes, even the elbow could be scandalous. Ankles were downright pornographic. A woman flashing her ankle might as well have shouted, "I fornicate with demons" in Latin. So dresses grew longer. Sleeves ballooned like guilt-filled clouds. You weren't just dressing for modesty. You were swaddling yourself in a textile panic attack. Now, if you were wondering, what about men? Don't worry. The clergy had opinions about your codpiece too. Tight hose was acceptable until it started accentuating the wrong bulges. That's an actual quote from a bishop, probably one who spent too long staring. The church declared form-fitting fashion a mockery of creation, as though wearing trousers that hugged your thighs was a direct slap in God's face. Imagine being excommunicated because your pants were too tight. Peak medieval energy. Vanity wasn't just frowned upon. It was flammable. Literally. Clergymen didn't just condemn mirrors, they burned them. A 13th century sermon in Paris referred to mirrors as the devil's glass. Women who owned them were accused of summoning spirits, though the only spirit most saw was the ghost of their social life dying under another sackcloth tunic. Owning a mirror meant you were arrogant, vain, and probably in league with Satan. Heaven forbid you check for spinach in your teeth. Cosmetics banned. Rouge was the paint of Jezebel. Perfume was the scent of Lucifer's breath. Hair dye was witchcraft. And don't even think about plucking your eyebrows lest you be mistaken for a harlot trying to trap holy men. So women had to balance on a tightrope ugly enough to please God but not so hideous they would scare off husbands. A spiritual challenge that doubled as a marriage strategy. But here's the real kicker: the church sold fashion rules as morality. Dressing modestly wasn't just about respect, it was your ticket out of hell. If your neckline dipped too low, you risked eternal fire. If your belt was too ornate, congratulations, you are now prideful, the deadliest of the 7 sins. Every accessory became a spiritual landmine. A hair ribbon, pride. Decorative buttons, lust. Embroidery, sloth, apparently because you clearly had too much time. And if you think this insanity stayed in the church walls, guess again. Preachers held outdoor sermons where they publicly shamed people's outfits. Entire villages would gather to watch their neighbour get roasted for having dyed hems. "Repent your velvet," they'd shout, probably while wearing itchy wool sacks. Imagine being dragged in front of your town and condemned for your boots. Thy shoelaces are vanity's noose sounds like satire. It wasn't. It gets better. Monks wrote fashion guides. No joke. There are surviving manuscripts telling women how to layer garments to hide their curves, and men how to choose colours that wouldn't incite lustful gazes. Beige, grey and sorrow were always safe. One popular guide was titled "Against the Fickleness of Female Apparel," which sounds like it was written by someone who hadn't seen a woman in 30 years, but had very strong feelings about tunics. Spoiler it was. And when people didn't listen, the punishment was public humiliation, or worse, exclusion from communion, which was a spiritual death sentence. Some communities even enforced dress codes via local priests. Show up to mass with flashy colours, and you might be sent home to meditate on your pride. That meant missing the week's only hot bread and being side-eyed by everyone for the next month. Small price to pay for daring to wear burgundy. Let's not forget religious orders themselves wore uniforms that became their own kind of fashion. The Franciscans wore brown, the Dominicans black and white, the Cistercians went full ghost in head-to-toe white wool. Ironically, they created the first capsule wardrobes without realizing it. Their fashion choices were driven by humility and poverty, but still said, "I belong to a very exclusive club that looks down on your bright blue tunic." And in the middle of all this madness, some folks rebelled the only way they could by quietly layering silks under plain cloaks or stitching hidden messages into hems. It was like medieval protest graffiti, but in thread. One noblewoman allegedly had a secret petticoat that read, "I wear this for me, not for monks." She was caught, flogged and banned from court. But hey, fashion is pain, especially when it's inflicted by clergy. So the next time you roll your eyes at modern dress codes, no crop tops in school, no ripped jeans at work, just remember at least no one's accusing you of heresy for showing your ankles. You may get weird looks at brunch, but no one's tossing your mirror into a holy fire. The church may have saved souls, but it tried to damn all fashion sense. In the medieval world, your clothes didn't just whisper about your social status, they screamed. Loudly. With frayed sleeves, mud-caked hems, and the faint aroma of pickled despair, your garments betrayed far more than just body odour. They announced who you were, where you belonged, what you could and couldn't afford, and which diseases you were statistically most likely to carry. You might not have had a last name, but your tunic colour that was practically your resume. For peasants, dressing was less about fashion and more about surviving the weather. Scratchy wool, faded browns, and sweat-stained linen made up the average villager's wardrobe. Clothes were patched, repatched, and often shared across siblings, generations, or livestock, whichever needed it more. Your outfit said, "I work in the fields, I haven't bathed in 3 weeks." And yes, that stain is from a goose. If you were lucky, it still resembled a tunic. If not, it was a burlap riddle held together by hope and pig twine. The colour of your clothes also told a story, or rather told on you. Bright colours were usually reserved for the upper classes because achieving vibrant dyes required exotic ingredients and money. A deep blue meant you might be a merchant, a warm crimson, probably nobility or someone aspiring hard. If you were caught wearing royal purple and weren't directly employed by a king or god, you were flirting with prison. So peasants stuck with what they could get, dirt-coloured dirt. But even among the poor, there were signals. A neatly mended sleeve might say, "I'm not rich, but I'm respectable." Torn cuffs with dried blood, "I was in a bar fight and possibly lost." A missing shoe, "Don't ask." Peasant fashion wasn't silent, it just mumbled its messages through tears, stitches and hay. Medieval villages were like fashion runways where every model walked with a limp and smelled faintly of fermented cabbage. In towns, tradespeople had their own subtle uniforms. A baker might have flour-dusted cuffs and singed hems. A blacksmith's apron was a badge of sweaty honour, smelling like fire and regret. Tailors wore clothes just slightly better than their clients, which they used as walking advertisements. "Look at this stitching." You too could have arm mobility. Merchants often sported more flamboyant coats to stand out in the market, like crows in a sea of damp pigeons. Women's fashion also acted as a flashing signboard if you knew how to read it. A wimple could say, "I'm a respectable wife," or "I haven't shown my hair since 1320. A simple belt indicated modesty, while a jewelled girdle shouted, "My husband has a manor and a gambling problem." Widows wore dark clothes not out of grief, but because black dye was expensive. It was like mourning with a flex. Clothing was less about emotion and more about economic theatre. Of course, the nobility lived in a world where clothing was a declaration of dominance. Layers upon layers of embroidered nonsense furs from animals you couldn't pronounce, and shoes so long they needed toe chains to walk. Every outfit was a war cry. "I am rich. I am powerful, and I haven't bent over in years." Even servants in noble houses dressed better than most free villagers, because being near wealth was its own strange contagion, royalty. That was an entirely different language of fashion. Kings and queens didn't wear clothes, they draped themselves in statements. Ermine fur, cloth of gold, and silks that had crossed continents. Their fashion said, "I control your taxes and probably your afterlife." Royal garments were so loaded with meaning that entire legal documents existed just to describe them. The average royal outfit could fund a cathedral, or 10 plagues. And what of the clergy? Ironically, they were some of the best-dressed figures in town if you ignored their constant complaints about vanity. Bishops wore rings, silks, embroidered robes and golden headgear that could double as cake stands. Their clothes whispered piety but screamed wealth. Monks, meanwhile, had uniforms too, but even their sack-like robes differed by order colour and degree of commitment to shunning comfort. "I've taken a vow of poverty," said the man in handcrafted leather sandals. Then there were the outsiders, the ones no one wanted to dress like lest they be mistaken for them. Lepers wore bells and specific tunics to mark their contagion. Criminals sometimes had identifying marks or forced clothing, and beggars developed their own ragged chic, anything found stolen or held together with goat spit. Dressing like one of these groups could result in a beating arrest or worse, being left outside city walls with only your fleas for company. Children, unsurprisingly, weren't spared the social coding of clothes. Rich kids wore miniature versions of adult fashion with buttons, embroidery, and impractical fabrics designed purely to impress other nobles. Poor children, usually naked until 5, then bundled in hand-me-downs that looked like they'd fought a bear and lost. Even in childhood, fashion wasn't for fun. It was your family's status report, and it had jam on it. Jewellery and accessories were the punctuation of medieval fashion. A brooch might mean nobility. A pouch with coins meant, "Please rob me." A rosary told people you were devout, or at least wanted them to think so, and a dagger on your belt said you were prepared to argue about it. Fashion didn't stop at clothing, it bled into every clasp hat, shoe and ring. You didn't just wear your status, you jingled with it. Clothing even affected how people were buried. The rich were wrapped in fine linens and paraded in death robes that cost more than most weddings. The poor were often buried in the same clothes they died in, sometimes wrapped in a shroud if someone cared enough. In death as in life, your outfit declared your rank. God might judge your soul, but your neighbours judged your corpse's tailoring. So next time you pull on your sweatpants or torn hoodie and sigh with relief, remember in medieval times that outfit would have made an entire village gasp. Not because of the smell, but because it said, "I have comfort and don't care who sees." In the Middle Ages, that kind of freedom was unthinkable. Clothes weren't just fabric, they were your biography, your prison, and your very loud, very itchy confession. The medieval itch was not just a metaphor, it was a way of life. If you existed between the 5th and 15th centuries and had skin chances, it was irritated, inflamed or colonised by something that bit burrowed or bred. Hygiene was an abstract concept. Hot water, a luxury, and medical knowledge a strange cocktail of superstition and leeches. Fashion didn't help. In fact, what people wore actively invited the medieval ecosystem to party on their bodies. Start with fleas. The moment a wool tunic touched your skin, it became a penthouse for bloodsuckers. Fleas thrived in the fold seams and warmth of peasant and noble garments alike. They didn't discriminate between serf and squire, just blood type. Lice followed close behind, laying eggs in underlayers, crawling through seams like tiny squatters with a vengeance. Even linen praised as the clean layer became a lice buffet within hours. People scratched constantly, not because they were nervous, but because they were hosts. Then came the fungi. With little access to soap, few changes of clothes and layers that trapped sweat like medieval saunas, people were walking terrariums for fungal colonies. Ringworm made its rounds despite not being a worm and thrived in the damp darkness between fabric and flesh. Jockitch athlete's foot and other unnamed medieval moulds feasted in silence. You weren't unclean by choice, you just had no way to be anything else. Filth was part of fashion's price. Clothes were rarely washed, partly because washing required time labour and a stream that hadn't been used as a toilet. Even when laundering did occur, it was usually done with cold water, harsh ash lye or urine. Yes, human urine stored in jugs and poured over linen like an early attempt at dry cleaning. The result was not cleanliness, but a new, stronger scent that said, "I've tried, but life is hard." Between the body odour mildew and chamber pot backsplash, people walked around in a personal cloud of organic regret. Fashion itself was a co-conspirator in the medieval itch. Many outfits were designed more for symbolism than comfort. Long dragging sleeves collected dirt like they were auditioning to be mop. Tight hose and layered undergarments chafed constantly, and leather boots turned into moist leather traps. Women's girdles and corset-like bodices pressed skin against hot, unwashed fabric for days. The clothing didn't breathe. It festered. Even the fancier garments weren't immune. Furs often thought of as luxurious were among the worst offenders. Lined with the pelts of marten squirrels or even cats, they weren't cleaned properly before sewing. They still carried the oils, dandruff and parasites of their former animal owners. When nobles wrapped themselves in sable, they were essentially embracing a flea colony. Expensive, yes. Sanitary, absolutely not. Itching wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. The constant presence of vermin and irritants changed how people moved, how they interacted, and even how they worshipped. Monks sometimes viewed itching as penance proof that the body was being humbled. Some ascetics refused to bathe at all, believing cleanliness to be vanity. Others took vows of discomfort, wearing hair shirts woven from goat bristles, directly on the skin, which made even a mild fungal infection feel like divine punishment. Children fared no better. Young bodies stuffed into adult-like clothes became breeding grounds for every known medieval rash. They were often barefoot, often unbathed, and often too busy not starving to worry about scratching. Schoolboys shared cloaks, lice, and infections in equal measure. Girls especially wore tight bodices early on, compressing their chests and trapping sweat in a misguided rush toward looking modest. The rich tried to fight the itch with perfume powders and superstition. Scented pomanders worn around the neck were filled with cloves and herbs to mask the smell of rot. Some nobles stuffed lavender or wormwood into their sleeves, which did little for hygiene but made scratching more fragrant. Others believed that carrying certain stones or amulets would repel bugs. Spoiler, they did not. Meanwhile, the fleas threw medieval raves in brocade waistcoats and mink-lined collars. Doctors offered advice that ranged from mildly useful to medically catastrophic. One popular remedy for lice involved soaking your head in vinegar and wrapping it in linen for a week. Another prescribed bathing in wine, but most simply prescribed prayers or told patients their suffering was divine punishment. By the time a cure was found, the patient either died or got used to scratching in their sleep. Either way, the itch endured. There were even laws that indirectly contributed to the scratching epidemic. Sumptuary laws restricted who could wear which materials and colours, meaning that poor folks were often stuck with coarse fabrics that irritated the skin. If you couldn't afford linen, you wore rough-spun wool. If you couldn't afford wool, you wore sacking. And if you wore sacking, congratulations, you were now itchy and embarrassed. Fashion and class collided, and comfort lost. Seasonal changes made it worse. In summer, sweat and humidity turned underlayers into microbial swamps. In winter, heavy wool retained dampness and froze close to the skin. There was no right time to wear medieval clothing, only a choice between moist heat rash and frozen itching. People weren't uncomfortable for a day or two, they were in a permanent state of scratchy suffering. Even religious festivals offered no relief. Pilgrims who travelled for days to visit relics often returned with new relics of their own, ringworm lice and skin infections that lasted longer than the pilgrimage itself. The crowds, the dirt roads, the shared bedding in hostels, it all formed a medieval spa of suffering. And when they returned, their townsfolk greeted them with cautious joy and cautious scratching. It's easy to think of the medieval itch as a background nuisance, but in truth it shaped lives. It defined how people stood never quite still, how they bathed rarely, how they loved very carefully, and how they aged itchier every year. It was part of being alive. The average person had more parasites than teeth, and clothing meant to protect the body often delivered the opposite. So next time your modern sweater feels a little scratchy or your waistband pinches, take a deep breath. You're not living in a time when your shirt might be hosting a flea wedding. You can wash your jeans. You have socks that don't sprout mushrooms. You live in an age where fashion might still hurt, but at least it doesn't crawl.